Lesson 47, The Age of Camelot. Lesson 47, The Age of Camelot. Lesson 47, The Age of Camelot. Was John F. Kennedy a great president? Was John F. Kennedy a great president? Introduction. In 1961, when John F. Kennedy was the youngest man elected to the presidency, replaced Dwight Eisenhower, one of the oldest, the atmosphere in the White House changed. The handsome, charming young president and his graceful wife, Jacqueline, brightened the house considerably, making it exciting to visit. Some evenings, famous musicians, opera singers performed. Noted actors read scenes from plays, or ballet dancers performed classic works. These social events made the White House a showcase for arts and culture. At Kennedy's inauguration, a new musical called Camelot had recently begun its Broadway run. The musical's main characters was the legendary King Arthur, who ruled an enchanted kingdom called Camelot. As the play unfolds, Arthur establishes an order of knights called the Knights of the Round Table. Dedicated to doing noble deeds, the order attracts the best and bravest knights to the realm. At the outset of Kennedy's administration, fans of Camelot's ideals hoped Kennedy would be a similarly gifted leader. Sadly, Kennedy died before most people could determine whether he had lived up to these Arthurian expectations. In an interview after his death, Jacqueline Kennedy recalled the words of her husband's favorite song from the musical, written by Alan J. Lerner. In that song, Lerner writes about a brief yet dignified moment in time. Many Americans believed Kennedy's time in office was a brief shining moment, while others debated the merits of the young president's actions. In this lesson, you will learn how these differing opinions developed. Life in Camelot. As the cover of this Life magazine suggests, many Americans associated Kennedy's White House with the mythical kingdom of Camelot. Broadway musical Camelot premiered in New York City just after Kennedy was elected president. It became an overnight hit when the public learned that the cast album was one of President Kennedy's favorite records. President Kennedy's domestic record. On a chilly day in Washington, D.C., a large crowd gathered in front of the Capitol to watch John F. Kennedy be sworn in as the 35th president. In his address, President Kennedy outlined his vision of the road ahead. Let the word go forth from this time and place that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by the hard and bitter peace. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. John F. Kennedy Inaugural Address, January 20th. 1961. The young president's dedication to the ideal of liberty touched the hearts and minds of many Americans. Kennedy closed his address by appealing to his audience's sense of idealism, urging Americans to personally commit to public service in an often quoted statement, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Kennedy takes office with a narrow election victory. Kennedy's dazzling inaugural festivities, including the address and inaugural ball, established the tone of elegance and youthful vigor that became known as the Kennedy style. Even before Kennedy was elected president, people adored his charisma, a combination of charm and personal magnetism that drew fans and supporters. At campaign stops, young people cheered him as if he were a movie star. One senator observed that Kennedy possessed the best qualities of Elvis Presley and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. During the campaign, Kennedy and his opponent Richard Nixon expressed similar views on many issues. For example, both vowed to reinvigorate the sluggish economy and halt the spread of communism. However, Kennedy was unique in criticizing the Eisenhower-Nixon administration for allowing a missile gap to open between the United States and the Soviet Union. Unless something was done to restore American military superiority, Kennedy warned, the periphery edges of the free world will slowly be nibbled away. The most obvious difference between the two presidential candidates was their personal style. This contrast became clear on September 26, 1960, when they met in history's first live televised presidential debate. More than 70 million viewers tuned in, while others listened to the radio. For many Americans, the debate was their first opportunity to closely study the candidates, especially Kennedy, who was less well known. Weakened by a serious knee injury and a bout of the flu, Nixon appeared nervous and uneasy. His face was pale, made worse by his refusal to wear any stage makeup. In contrast, Kennedy appeared relaxed and confident. For this reason, most of the people watching the debate on television believed Kennedy won. Those who listened to the radio thought Nixon was the winner. In the closest election since 1888, Kennedy barely defeated Nixon. As a result, Kennedy took office without a clear electoral mandate. This lack of voter support would severely disadvantage him in his dealings with Congress. An administration of the best and brightest. Like the legendary King Arthur, Kennedy wanted to surround himself with the best and brightest advisors he could find. Some, like National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, had attended elite universities. Others, such as Secretary of Defense and former president of Ford Motor Company Robert McNamara, were top executives. To the surprise of many people, Kennedy selected his 35-year-old brother, Robert, to be the Attorney General. When people criticized Robert as too young for the position, the president joked, "I see nothing wrong with giving Robert some legal experience before he goes out to practice law." Oof. Kennedy's inaugural call to public service attracted many talented young people from around the country to Washington. Those who joined his administration found public service to be exciting, even glamorous. Like the president, the administration worked hard and played hard. Fueled with fresh idealism, they hoped to change the world. Kennedy's new frontier challenges the nation. While campaigning for president, Kennedy began to outline his vision for changing the world. In his speech accepting the Democratic presidential nomination, he told Americans, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. Beyond that frontier are the uncharted areas of science and space, unresolved problems of peace and war, unconquered pockets of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus." John F. Kennedy, July 15, 1960. Once in office, Kennedy worked to transform the new frontier rhetoric into a list of concrete goals. To expand opportunities, he called for an increase in educational aid, new programs to end poverty, and a tax cut to stimulate economic growth. Finally, to protect liberty and to expand opportunity, he called for increase in educational aid and new programs to end poverty, and a tax cut to stimulate economic growth. To promote equality, he sought to raise the minimum wage, fund medical care for the elderly, and to make cities more livable. To guarantee civil rights, he hoped to enact legislation banning racial discrimination. Finally, to protect liberty and democracy, he called for a large increase in defense spending. Kennedy had difficulty passing his legislative agenda, or a list of programs to enact in Congress. Despite Democrats' legislative majority, he did succeed in raising the minimum wage and enacting some urban development programs, but a coalition of conservative Southern Democrats and Republicans who voted to block reform stalled much of Kennedy's agenda. After several failures, Kennedy gave up some of his programs. "There's no sense in raising hell," he claimed, and then not being successful. Reviving the economy. Kennedy had mixed success in his stated aim to get the economy moving again. When Kennedy took office, the nation was experiencing a mild recession, which he hoped to solve by laying out a two-part approach to promoting economic recovery. The first part of his plan was to increase spending on defense. By this time, Kennedy was aware that the missile gap he had mentioned in his campaign was not real. In fact, the United States possessed far more weaponry than the Soviet Union. President Kennedy's effective campaign rhetoric, but focused on what he called the missile gap. This gap referred to a supposed dearth in nuclear missiles compared to the Soviet Union. In reality, the United States was a larger nuclear defense arsenal than the USSR. Nonetheless, Kennedy convinced Congress to boost defense spending by nearly 20% in 1961. Over the next few years, the government pumped billions of dollars into the economy to increase the nation's stockpile of missiles and other high-tech weapons, like nuclear submarines. The second part of Kennedy's plan was to institute a major tax cut to put more money in people's pockets and to stimulate economic growth. This strategy was less successful as conservatives in Congress opposed any tax cut that would lead to an unbalanced federal budget. Even some liberal Democrats opposed cutting taxes when so many of the nation's needs were still unmet. As the liberal economist John Kenneth Galbraith observed, "I am not quite sure I see what the advantage is in having a few dollars to spend is
If the air is too dirty to breathe, the water is too polluted to drink, and the streets are filthy, and the schools are so bad that the young perhaps wisely stay away. James T. Patterson, American in the 20th Century, 1976. Even without Kennedy's proposed tax cuts, the recession came to an end. By the close of 1961, the economy entered a period of growth that would last through the decade. A cautious approach to civil rights. Kennedy had even less success passing the civil rights legislation in Congress. During his campaign, Kennedy called for an end to racial discrimination. He responded to Atlanta authorities jailing Martin Luther King Jr. by asking his brother Robert to arrange King's release. Widely reported in the press, news of his brother's efforts on King's behalf helped Kennedy secure the African-American vote. Once in office, Kennedy became more cautious, fearing that bold action on civil rights would split the Democratic Party between North and South. Although he ordered his administration to vigorously enforce existing civil rights laws, he did not propose any new civil rights legislation during his first 2 years in office. In the spring of 1963, televised violence against peaceful protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, horrified much of the nation. Sickened by the incident, President Kennedy addressed the nation on the issue of civil rights. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because of his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public schools available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who will represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content with the counsels of patience and delay? A week later, the president submitted a broad civil rights bill to Congress. Once again, the coalition of Republican and conservative Southern Democratic lawmakers blocked Kennedy's proposed legislation. Kennedy proposes landing a man on the moon. Kennedy's most exciting new frontier challenge, space exploration, developed from a Cold War embarrassment. In 1957, the Soviet Union surprised the world by launching the first artificial satellite into orbit. Called Sputnik, or Little Traveler in Russian, the unmanned satellite traveled 18,000 miles per hour. The USSR launched Sputnik 2 a month later with a dog on board. Meanwhile, delays and failed launches plagued American efforts to send rockets into space. Around the world, newspapers ridiculed U.S. rockets as flopniks and kaputniks. When asked what Americans would find if they ever reached the moon, nuclear physicist Edward Teller quipped Russians. Nuclear would find if they ever reached the moon. Physicist Edward Teller quipped Russians. In 1958, President Eisenhower responded to the Soviet challenge by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. When Kennedy took office, NASA had successfully launched its first communication and weather satellite into space. But on April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union stunned the world again by sending the first human astronaut, Yuri Gagarin, into space. 6 weeks later, Kennedy made a dramatic announcement. I believe that this nation should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Speech to a joint session of Congress, May 25, 1961. NASA worked rapidly to achieve this goal. In 1961, astronaut Alan Shepard completed a short space flight, and a year later, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. On July 20th, 1969, 8 years after Kennedy declared the moon landing goal, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edward Buzz Aldrin Jr. of the Apollo space program landed on the moon. The world watched in awe as Armstrong stepped onto the moon's surface, declaring, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Section 2, President Kennedy's record in foreign affairs. As President Kennedy's greatest triumphs and worst mistakes were in foreign affairs. As President Kennedy's greatest triumphs and worst mistakes were in foreign affairs. U.S. relations with Cuba proved to be especially troublesome for the president, and the crisis over the Soviet missile sites in Cuba brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. Fidel Castro establishes a communist regime in Cuba. In 1959, communist revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro ousted Cuban dictator Fulgencio Bautista The United States suddenly had a communist regime or government for a neighbor, just 90 miles off the Florida coast. Once in power, Castro established strong ties with the Soviet Union, and the USSR sent advisors, weapons, and financial aid. With Soviet aid, Castro transformed Cuba into a communist country with a planned economy. Government planners began to control almost all economic decisions. The government overtook U.S. oil refineries and farms on the island and seized private businesses and properties from wealthy Cubans. Averse to living under a communist regime, many Cubans fled the island. Most of these exiles, or people who live outside their home country, settled in southern Florida. Shortly after taking office, Kennedy learned that the CIA was training some of the Cuban exiles in Florida and Guatemala as guerrilla fighters. Their covert mission was to return Cuba and lead a popular uprising that would topple Castro and his regime. The Bay of Pigs fiasco failed to dislodge Castro. The CIA officials who briefed Kennedy on the Cuban invasion plan assured the new president that their invasion would inspire Cubans to rise up and rebel against Castro. CIA Director Allen Dulles informed Kennedy that if he wanted to halt Castro's growing influence in Latin America, the time to act was now or never. Eager to demonstrate his strength as a Cold War president, Kennedy approved the invasion plan. On April 17, 1961, a small army of Cuban exiles sailed into the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. Their landing was a disaster. CIA trainers told the exiles they would come ashore on an empty beach, but their boats ran aground on a coral reef. And once the exiles reached land, Cuban troops quickly killed or captured them. Meanwhile, the expected public uprising never occurred. A few officials tried to persuade Kennedy to send U.S. warplanes to support the exile forces, but Kennedy did not want to involve the United States further in this poorly executed fiasco. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, people throughout Latin America criticized Kennedy for interfering in another country's affairs. Shouldering the blame, Kennedy remarked, "Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." Escalating Cold War tension in Berlin. In June 1961, Kennedy and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev organized a summit meeting in Vienna, Austria. Summit meetings are held by heads of state to discuss important topics. The discussion in this particular meeting included the future of Berlin. From the end of World War II, Berlin had been a divided city. East Berlin served as the capital of communist East Germany, while West Berlin, although surrounded by East Germany, remained under the control of wartime allies. The border between Eastern and Western Europe was eventually closed everywhere except in Berlin. The border between Eastern and Western Europe was eventually closed everywhere except in Berlin. As a result, Berlin became the only escape route for hundreds of thousands of East Germans trapped behind the Iron Curtain to flee their country. By 1961, approximately 25,000 East German refugees were crossing into West Berlin each day. At that rate, East Germany would soon lose much of its workforce. At the Vienna summit, Khrushchev informed Kennedy that he would not allow the flow of refugees into West Berlin to continue. Kennedy responded that he was prepared to defeat West Berlin, even at the risk of war. Khrushchev decided that East Germany's only remaining option was to wall itself off from West Berlin. On August 13, 1961, East German workers began to construct a barbed wire fence between East and West Berlin. Later, the government replaced the fence with tall concrete walls. The Berlin Wall made it all but impossible for East Germans to escape to freedom in West Berlin. The United States and other Western European nations were outraged by the building of the Berlin Wall. To show American support for the people of West Berlin, Kennedy spoke to an audience in front of the wall. "There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner." John F. Kennedy, June 26, 1963. Despite this, Kennedy was not willing to risk war to tear down the wall. Privately, he said, "A wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days on the brink of nuclear war. Just over a year after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, President Kennedy focused his attention once again on Cuba. In October of 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba discovered that the Soviets were building a missile launching site on the island. From these sites, missiles carrying nuclear warheads could easily reach most major cities in the United States. To discuss U.S. response strategies, Kennedy assembled a group of his 12 most trusted advisors, called the Executive Committee for National Security, later known as ExComm. Its members agreed that the United States must halt construction of Soviet missile sites. Failure to remove this threat would endanger American cities and make the United States seem weak to European allies and anti-Castro forces in Latin America. The ExComm would not agree on how to handle the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some advisors urged the president to bomb the missile site before the construction could be completed. Others suggested blockading Cuban ports to prevent Soviet ships from bringing missiles to the island. This blockade was referred to as a quarantine because international law technically stipulated that a naval blockade was an act of war. Faced with both strategies, Kennedy chose the quarantine plan. On October 22nd, Kennedy publicly revealed the discovery of the missile sites and his decision to quarantine Cuba. He warned that the United States would view any nuclear missile launched from Cuba as a Soviet attack on the United States. He also demanded that the Soviets remove all offensive weapons from the island. For the next 2 days, Soviet ships continued to move towards Cuba. Fearing that the United States could be on the brink of nuclear war, Kennedy put the U.S. military on high alert. "I guess this is the week I earn my salary," he nervously joked. On October 24th, Khrushchev ordered Soviet ships approaching Cuba to either slow down or turn around. Secretary of State Dean Rusk commented, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." A few days later, Khrushchev sent a note to Kennedy agreeing to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba if Kennedy agreed to end the Cuban blockade and promised not to invade Cuba. The next day, Khrushchev sent a second note. In it, he proposed removing Cuban missiles if the United States removed its missiles from Turkey, which bordered the USSR. Believing the U.S. missiles in Turkey were outdated, Kennedy had already decided to remove them. However, he did not want Khrushchev to think the United States was yielding to Soviet demands, so ExComm advised Kennedy to pretend he did not receive the second note. Publicly, Kennedy accepted the first deal. Privately, he sent Robert Kennedy to the Soviet embassy to mediate the second deal. On October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to remove all Soviet missiles from Cuba. About 3 months later, the United States removed its missiles from Turkey. Easing Cold War tensions. The Cuban Missile Crisis led Kennedy and his advisors to reconsider the massive retaliation doctrine of the Eisenhower years. Kennedy began to discuss the need for a milder response to local Cold War conflicts. When communists seemed poised to overtake Vietnam, a small country in Southeast Asia, Kennedy tested this new approach. He sent money and military advisors to Vietnam to build a non-communist force in the country. By the end of 1962, more than 9,000 American military advisors were helping to defend Vietnam from communist takeover. The missile crisis frightened both Kennedy and Khrushchev in how close their countries had come to nuclear war. As a result, both men devised ways to ease tensions between the superpowers. The two leaders first established their own hotline as a line of communication between them that would be kept open at all times, so that they could contact each other instantly during a crisis. This hotline still exists and has been tested once every hour since 1963. Later the same year, the superpowers took another step to establish more amicable relations. Along with Great Britain, they signed the Test Ban Treaty. This agreement banned above-ground nuclear testing while allowing underground nuclear weapons tests to continue. By signing, the United States and the Soviet Union demonstrated that they could cooperate on important issues. Aiding development in foreign countries. President Kennedy was deeply concerned about communism spreading to developing countries, or countries that were poorer and less industrialized than the wealthy, developed countries of North America, Western Europe, and parts of Asia. In a San Francisco campaign speech, Kennedy spoke about his vision for aiding the developing world. There is not enough money in all of America to relieve the misery of the undeveloped world in a giant soup kitchen, he said, but there is enough know-how to help those nations help themselves. To spread this know-how, Kennedy issued an executive order that created the Peace Corps. This new government agency sent thousands of men and women to developed nations to support local communities in areas like education, farming, and healthcare. Before traveling overseas, Peace Corps volunteers learned languages and skills necessary to build and help operate schools and health clinics, teach farming methods, and to plant crops. Kennedy also launched a Latin American aid program called the Alliance for Progress to provide economic and technical aid to Latin American nations while encouraging democratic reform. Unfortunately, the program had little impact since wealthy elites in Latin American nations resisted reform efforts. Most Alliance for Peace funds eventually ended up in the pockets of anti-communist dictators, who used the money to fight communist rebels and others who opposed their rule. Like the volunteers in the commemorative stamp, Peace Corps workers sought to improve life for the poor in developing countries since 1961. Volunteers are of all ages and come from a variety of backgrounds. Most share a strong commitment to helping to create a free and peaceful world. President Kennedy often conferred with his younger brother, Attorney General Robert Bobby Kennedy. In order to reduce tensions during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bobby conferred secretly with Soviet diplomats. Many criticized Robert Kennedy's youth when his brother initially appointed him Attorney General. The tragic and controversial end to Camelot. In late November 1963, President Kennedy and the First Lady traveled to Texas to build support for Kennedy's upcoming re-election campaign. Just before noon on November 22nd, the Kennedys joined Texas Governor John Connally and his wife in a motorcade through downtown Dallas. It was a sunny day and people crowded the streets eager to catch a glimpse of the presidential couple. Watching the cheering crowd, Mrs. Connally leaned over and told the president, "You can't say that Dallas isn't friendly to you today." Moments later, gunshots rang out. A national tragedy unfolds in Dallas. The motorcade took the president's car past the Texas school book depository, where Lee Harvey Oswald, a worker in the building, waited on the 6th floor. As the cars came within range, Oswald fired 3 shots. One bullet missed the motorcade. 2 bullets hit Kennedy in the neck and head. One of the bullets struck Governor Connally. The driver rushed both men to the hospital, and Connally survived. Doctors frantically worked to revive Kennedy, but at 1 p.m. he was declared dead. 2 hours after the shooting, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson met Jacqueline Kennedy with the president's coffin at the Dallas airport. They would return to Washington together. Before the plane took flight, a local Texas judge swore Johnson in as the nation's 36th president. Jacqueline Kennedy stood beside Johnson as he took the oath of office. Dallas police quickly captured Oswald, charging him with the president's murder. Authorities were aware that Oswald strongly supported Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution and had lived in the Soviet Union for 3 years. Before they could learn of Oswald's motives for assassinating Kennedy, Oswald was killed as police attempted to move him to a more secure jail. With scores of newspaper and television reporters as witness, a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby jumped out of the crowd and shot Oswald in the abdomen. Television viewers watched in horror as live news cameras broadcast Oswald's murder into their homes. On November 22nd, a horse-drawn carriage transported Kennedy's body from the White House to the Capitol building. There were hundreds of thousands of people walked past his casket to pay their final respects. The following day, up to 1 million people lined the streets of Washington as the funeral procession carried the president's casket to Arlington National Cemetery. At the cemetery, Kennedy's wife and brothers lit an eternal gas flame on his grave. People mourned Kennedy's death across the nation and around the world. Most Americans old enough to remember it can recall exactly where they were when they heard the news of Kennedy's assassination. A poll taken at the time reported that about 2/3 of Americans felt the death of the president as the loss of someone very close and dear. Questions and conspiracy theories surround the assassination. Kennedy's assassination raised many pressing questions. Had Oswald acted alone, or was he part of the larger conspiracy to murder the president? If he did not act alone, with whom was he working, and why did Ruby murder him? Eager to uncover the truth, President Johnson created a special commission to investigate the assassination, headed by the Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren. The commission became known as the Warren Commission. After a year of analyzing thousands of document pages and considering more than 550 witnesses, the Warren Commission concluded the following in its 1964 report. On the basis of evidence before the Commission, it concludes that Oswald acted alone. Therefore, to determine the motives for the assassination of President Kennedy, one must look to the assassin himself. Clues to Oswald's motives can be found in the family history, his education or lack of it, his acts, his writings, and his recollections of those who had close contacts with him throughout his life. Warren Report, 1964. Many Americans were not convinced by the Warren Commission's findings. In the years since Kennedy's death, numerous conspiracy theories and assassination myths have emerged. Some detail plots by the CIA, the FBI, or organized crime groups. Others involve secret agents from Cuba, the Soviet Union, other countries unfriendly to the United States at Kennedy's death. However, because Oswald was unable to testify, the full story of Kennedy's assassination may never be known. New Frontier, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, Bay of Pigs invasion, Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis, Test Ban Treaty, Peace Corps.